So we're moving on to the next and final session of today's conference, Stories and Situations. And I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes on how do ideas travel, lapses of communication within a time-space conundrum. I'm going to keep it really short because you're not here to listen to me. And what I'm going to do is just talk for a few minutes, share with you some thoughts I had before I pass on the mic next to Rosemary Orr. So I am in no way an expert into the topic, so please accept what I'm going to say as a subjective look into the question I'm proposing, and as a way for me to provide insights into some thoughts I had. And I'm going to do this using language as a vehicle, since that's the topic of the day, and as a vehicle for communication, because after all, what I'm going to be proposing here is very much subjective, and it's very personal, so don't read too much into it. So I arrived at this question, how do ideas travel, when I was asked to co-develop a conference for moderations. For a project that's taking place in 2 different cities, in Rotterdam and in Hong Kong, I started to wonder, how is it that what we do here in Rotterdam goes back to Hong Kong and vice versa? A question that actually most institutions consider when they think about their programs and who is watching and who's coming to the programs and how is the international world or the locality of it all is perceiving it. But most importantly, how is one idea, a concept, or a project in one place delivered in another? What happens to that idea when it goes to a new space, when there's a delay in time and when the receptors are different? A question that also a lot of the participants here today have been referring to, especially in relation to objects and how objects travel. Now, does this become a form of téléphone arabe, where words or a story is being morphed by more word of mouth? I don't know, but maybe. So that's why I would like to propose that we look at language as a vehicle for ideas and somewhat of an intangible vehicle. I would also stipulate for a morphology of language itself. Language is dependent on context, on time, on space, but also on the receptor. So if we look at ideas as vehicles and a tool to express ourselves, it is truly a facilitator, and it brings us closer to each other since it enables a certain form of understanding. But then again, it can also be an obstacle. As we very well know, it can lead to misunderstandings. And misunderstandings can happen in many different ways, not only with the question of, I'm not sure I understood completely what you're saying, so the use of language, but also, as an example, when I speak Arabic to another person, someone else who would be listening in onto us that doesn't speak the language would maybe consider that I was angry or speaking in an aggressive way. And over here, the tonality of it also affects the way language is perceived or the way we communicate to each other. Next to misunderstandings, we also have overlaps and repetition. Don't we say that history repeats itself? And maybe it repeats itself because we have a problem of narrating it, because we're not sure how we're telling it. So there are also overlaps, and we've established mechanisms against it. As an example, I would just refer to the phenomena of the patent or the solo envelope, and the phenomena of us actually sealing or officializing an idea so no one else could claim it as theirs. But I'm not going to go deep into questions of authorship. It was just a proposal. So now moving on, and as I would say in French, je vais passer du coq à l'âne, so go from one idea to another. I would like to focus back to look more closely at lapses, or mistakes in communication, and how those affect or survive throughout time. And for this, I would like to use an art historical example, because after all, I do work in a public art institution. What my proposal as an example is, it's a sculpture by Michelangelo, and it's called Moses. It lies in the Roman Basilica in San Pietro in Vincolini. I'm sorry, Vincenzo, again. And I'm going to show you an image of that sculpture. So here it is. So in depictions of the work, the Hebrew word karan was translated in the Vulgate as kornuta, which means horned, instead of coronata, which means radiant. And even though the reality is that it's supposed to mean radiant, I still see horns. I'm not sure what you see, but I can't get that image away from my head. So this is just an example of how an imprudent translation of an original primary source can take place. And I refer to this example not just as a translation mistake that survived throughout time, but also as how failure has led to new meanings or depictions. Now, through this example, we also realize that the mistake actually didn't quite survive throughout time, since we are aware of it today. And I would stipulate for an inherent goal that we have for reaching understanding, but also a responsibility that we feel towards memory. And I would argue that this responsibility is partly why ideas survive and why ideas travel. It's almost magnetic. And I believe it's due to a necessity for language to evolve within an ever-changing world. And now, as a way of bridging to the next talk by Rosemary Orr, Truth and Stories, if our goal is to reach a certain form of understanding, then perhaps this is also linked to a search for truth. How can we reach or express truth when language is by default faulty, and this because we are only human? I'll leave you on this note and pass it on to Rosemary Orr, which I'm particularly enthusiastic to have over here, and I'm sure it will break away from the arty talk we've been having all day. Thank you.
This is actually also quite a personal view of language and the traveling of ideas. But read anything you like into it. Don't listen to Amira. It doesn't have to be non-personal for you to read stuff into it, which is sort of the point of what I want to say. Let me see how we make this go. Truth. What's it for? Well, it is the aim of scientific inquiry, and I don't just mean, you know, science where you're cutting up a frog and you want to know what it looks like on the inside. Anything that is supposed to contribute to our body of factual knowledge, I suppose that's one thing that truth is for. Another thing it's for is for understanding. If we think we know the truth of a situation, we think we understand it. And actually a combination of facts and understanding often leads us to insight. Insight about not just, you know, who we are and our place in the world, but actually who you are and your place in the world and how it interacts with mine, no matter what you are, whether you're a mountain or a group of people in a room listening to me. There are various approaches to truth, and I anticipated that many of you would be familiar with at least correspondence theory of truth, the isomorphic mapping, one-to-one mapping of this thing corresponds to that thing, and it is a factual truth. It mirrors for me very much the Western perspective on truth, which is that it must be fact-based. Things can only be true if they're built on facts. Coherence theories of truth, where really we can only accept something as being true if it's coherent in our world, and that is our personal world and our shared propositions. If I'm explaining something to you about my life in Dublin, I have to explain a whole lot more than I have to explain to somebody who is from Dublin. How I can manage to minimalize or maximize truth really depends on the shared world that we live in or don't. And again, we have to find correspondence in the real world or the world outside our minds with the things we talk about. We have to present it coherently, and our truths have to be coherent with other people's worlds in order for any of them to become personal truths, in order for any of it to be an interpretation that we can actually have as a personal truth. I mean, I really believe that dogs are gorgeous. I have all kinds of reasons for believing that. One of them is because I've got one. She's really gorgeous, and her name is Sooty. But, you know, there are other people in the world who really don't think dogs are gorgeous. And I'm not sure which particular set of facts I will have started with to build my personal truth about dogs being gorgeous, but it really is true. There is no counter-speaking that one for me, huh? And it will have had to come through, you know, facts in the real world, putting them in some set of contexts that mean something to me, and then absorbing them to become real truths. I'm pretty sure when I was 2, I was terrified of dogs. Pretty sure. So something had to happen there. I had to build up some kind of a theory, and then it had to become personal, and can only become personal once it's been coherent. I'm actually not going to spend very long on this because I know you've been sitting all day. But so, idea of the correspondence theory of truth. The truth of a statement is determined only by how it relates to the world and whether it accurately describes or corresponds with that world. It also assumes that there is a world external to the mind. And I think we're all kind of okay with that. You know, we all agree that there was history, you know, dinosaurs and stuff. I wasn't there then, I don't know about you. So yeah, I'll go with there being a world external to my mind. Maybe an example of correspondence theory is we can say the boy is sitting at the table. You know, it's a picture, there's a boy, there's a chair in the background, he's sitting at the table. That's all pretty factual stuff, that's fine. Coherence theory of truth then, like I say, if you make a proposition, it must be coherent within some specified set of sentences or propositions or beliefs that are shared by the people with whom you communicate it to. There's no single set of universes. There's a world in the Netherlands where when you speak fairly gently. There's a world in Egypt, maybe where you speak Arabic, where it sounds different. And there's a world in Ireland where if you're trying to include your friends and sort of make clear in a conversational situation that they're part of the conversation, you have to insult them, preferably with something that's so close to some very unpleasant truth that it makes everybody squirm, and then they know they're in. Then they know they're in, and you love them. Don't ask me how that works, it just does. It's about an assortment of commonly held or discussed perspectives. Once you have your shared universes, then you can have coherence. Those would be the guys who have that. But the same picture, an example of a coherent truth then is this boy's bored. Now, how can I say that? Well, I can say that, and it can be true for you because we're all looking at this boy and we all share this, probably, I'm guessing, we share this idea of what it looks like when little boys are bored. I mean, I've got a little boy, that's what he looks like when he's bored. That's not my one, by the way. Yeah, though I can say this, and you know, you can go, and why can you do this? Because we share these assumptions about what things look, what it looks like when little boys are bored. Held truths, though. I'm actually avoiding saying personal truths because that's anathema in philosophy. But personally held truths, how we arrive at insights about the world. Well, they're very important because they allow emotion. I said I love dogs. There's clearly a whole lot of emotion in that. It entertains an understanding of obscure aspects of emotions as well, and the contexts in which they arise. I do love dogs, I definitely do, but if I walk past a really big one that's growling, kind of weird stuff happens. And I don't know, it remains true that I love dogs, but you know, there are all aspects of that particular emotion that, that are not easy for me to explain. But I know what it is. And these personally held truths, they allow reflection, they give rise to insight. So maybe the kind of insightful statement about this would be, the poor lad, he'd much rather be doing something else. And I can say this because that's how I feel when I look like this. I was never a little boy, by the way, I was a little girl, but I suspect I looked similar when I was bored. And that last bit, that's how I feel when I look like this, that's very important. There'll be more on that in a bit. So these are just examples of views on truth. There are many other theories of truth, but trying to establish correspondence truth, you have to apply an empirical method, and it's about the valid discovery of facts, and their reliability is very important, their usefulness is important. Coherence is about simulation, it's about the production of emergent effects without ad hoc intervention. Personal, trying to arrive at some kind of personally held truth, involves reflection, it involves thinking about things and placing things in context. And it is very egotistical, it's very from yourself. And the criteria for these kind of truths is that there's recognition. There's recognition of something. There's insight. I mean, I can say to you, right, that Eskimo does not have 40 words for snow. That probably doesn't really mean anything to you until you've had some context, until you've had some examples, until you've sat down and thought about it and reflected on it. And what does it mean to even call Inuit Eskimo anyway? The reflection is very important before personal truths can be held. But of all the truths that we have any attachment to, the personal truths are actually the strongest, oddly enough. And they can change. They can change for sure. But they are the ones we hold most strongly. As a linguist, I see a relationship here with semantics and pragmatics. Semantics is about meaning. It's the relationship between signifiers and the thing which is signified. But pragmatics is real meaning. It's what we actually mean when we say stuff, right? So the semantics of the cat is out of the bag. There's a bag, there was a cat in it, it's not in there anymore, cat's out, right? All right, pragmatics is something else, isn't it? The cat is out of the bag. Someone's let out that secret. Everybody knows now. It means something else. It's like, you know, I mean, the semantics of saying, here's to Amira, she's a horse's arse, is actually, I don't even want to think about what the semantics of that is. But if she was in Dublin and it was her birthday, that would be like, Amira, you're a great girl. We love you, you're one of us. Yeah? Yeah. Meaning is slippery. Trying to find meaning is slippery, you know. And what do? Linguists, there we go. We go looking at meaning. Oh, let's take words, let's look at them, let's cut it all up. We, you know, have nice big terms to describe it. Oh, look, homonymy. I have two words, bark and bark, and one of them means stuff that my dog does, and the other means the rough outside of the tree. Yeah, you have bow and bow. You know, bow, big thing you can put in your hair, and a bow is the thing you do when you bend over. And pair and pair. You can see where this is going. We're looking at stuff that spell the same, sounds different, spell the same, sounds the same. What does it all mean? Why do we bother? What's far more interesting here, I think, is polysemy. Is where you have words like table or get, or hooker and hooker, or flower and flower. To table something, there's all kinds of different meanings of table. There's a table, and I would say that this is the basic thing, right? I'd say for most people, you say the word table in English, and they're thinking of a flat thing with legs that you put stuff on. But you can also table your data in a spreadsheet. And that is related to the meaning of table, but it only has some elements of it. It doesn't have all of them. So spreadsheet tables don't have legs, but they do tend to be flat structures. To get things, to get something is to receive it from somebody else. But if I tell you a joke, do you get the joke? You're not actually physically receiving anything, but there's something in getting a joke which contains aspects of the meaning of get. I think we're all right with that. But here's something I find very interesting. We know from psycholinguistic experiments that if I say the word hooker to people in the room, that all kinds of other meanings will be activated. We can test this. It's something you can very concretely test. So if we say hooker, then all kinds of words in your mental lexicon have been activated. The word hook, thing that looks like this, point in the end, and you can put stuff over. Prostitute, sex, seediness, that's all in there as well. For some people, if they know that a hook is a song in an advertisement that gets you thinking or singing, you'd know that. And for me, there's also boats. And there's cultural pride, national pride, the sea, the roughness, the ocean. Where does that come from? That comes from me being Irish and knowing what a Galway hooker is. A Galway hooker it's like one of the tall ships. It's a very beautiful boat. But it's something that most people who are Irish would, you read about it, you see it with a sense of kind of, oh, look at this kind of fabulous stuff we did, weren't we great back in the old days when we sailed boats? Oh yeah, Armada, look at us, you know. Yeah, I'm sorry, it happens. But so something else gets activated in my head when I see the word hooker. I have all kinds of conflicting truths about that particular word. You know, at the same time as a prostitute is being pulled out of my mental lexicon, so is national pride and the salty ocean. That's kind of interesting. That's probably not happening with you. Flower and flower, that's another really interesting one. If you say to, so this is, you know, the issues with translation. If you say to a native English speaker, flower and flower, do you feel that they're related in meaning? I'm guessing, correct me, native English speakers, but I'm guessing most people go, no, not really, no, no. But here's the thing, for a Dutch speaker of English, those two words are related in meaning because there is a Dutch word, bloem, which means flower, and it means flower. So you can see that depending even on the native language that you speak, different words in your mental lexicon will get pulled up when you see a word in a foreign language. Meaning is a tricky thing. We can't really define it. In fact, what it comes down to is the words you say, what you think they mean, depends almost entirely on your life experience. So where is science now? What does the word significant mean? Moving on from polysemy to metonymy, which I think is more interesting because it starts reflecting how people actually speak, not just, you know, what's going on in your minds, but what people do, what their actions are when they speak. We love to use ideas to stand for other ideas. Anyone here who's ever worked in a bar, you know, somebody orders a ham sandwich, you know, this is for the ham sandwich down in the corner. You know, the beer is not for the ham sandwich, it's for the person eating the ham sandwich. But we love to talk about the people as the ham sandwiches. We do this all the time in our professional worlds, in our private worlds. We love metonymy, we love metaphor. And this is my favorite one. Small change got rained on with his own 38. It's Tom Waits. But it's actually very beautiful. It's very metaphorical. It's certainly metonymy because small change is this guy at you know, he's just this guy. And he gets shot, he gets rained on with his own 30. I love it, it's terrific. But we love this stuff, and we do it all the time. In fact, we're more interested in talking about things in non-factual way, non-explicit ways, than anything else. Here are some non-explicit truths, okay? These are truths we all know. If I put Sooty in the kitchen, she is no longer in the garden. When Amira comes in the room, her head comes with her. If I am at home, I came in through some opening unless I was born there and never left the building. If my cat was alive at 9 this morning and is still alive at the end of this presentation, she was also alive at 11:30. Buffalo do not wear trousers. Opening a box of muesli will not vaporize the house. And Sooty is smaller than Mount Kilimanjaro. These things are all true, okay? We don't tend to say these things, not because they're ridiculous. They're not actually not ridiculous. They're all true. They're pretty normal stuff. It's all true. But we don't talk about it. Why? Because, well, you know, it's not particularly interesting to talk about it like that. It's funny if you say it now, but generally in a conversation, facts about the world do not come up. We are actually not particularly interested in the obvious. In fact, when you state the obvious to people, often they will laugh or they'll think, huh? We're interested in the story around the obvious, and if there isn't a story around the obvious, you know what? We make one. Stories and truth. In ancient Ireland, there was a system of society under what's called Brehon law, and it was a law that was, it was a system of laws on which the society was built. Chief of the clan, of a local clan, would be the top person, right? There's always a man, the top man. And then there's a layer of important people underneath him, and then there's another layer of important people, and then there's the rest. And it was an interesting kind of a law. It was very egalitarian. It worked very well. In any case, so you have the chief, and the next person, actually, who is sort of the top man in the next layer, was the Shanachie. And the Shanachie was the storyteller. He was an antiquary, a historian, a genealogist, storyteller. He was the one who traces relationships, the one versed in law, the one versed in folklore. This is all taken straight from the definition given by Deneen's Irish translations. Shanchas, which is the root of the word Shanachie, is history, ancient law, lore, record or register, a minute description, a pedigree, an ancient tale, knowledge, tradition. These were the things the Shanachie was charged with. It was his task or her task to hand down the truth. That was the task. It was explicit. Your task is you must hand down the truth. You must bring the truth to the people, to the chief, to your own level, to the next level, to the rest. You must solve contentious situations in this way by bringing the truth. Yeah, so there's a problem. Amira is fighting with Samuel. What are we going to do? We're going to call in the Shanachie, and he's going to tell him a story to explain how to fix this. Okay, there's going to be no kind of discussing the price. There's going to be no saying the lights should be on, no, the lights should be off, no, no. And he will solve this contentious issue. It's his task to explain laws, not to state laws, but to explain laws and to explain rights. And when has he failed? He has failed if he has to resort to facts. And it's literally talked about as if you have to resort to bullying someone with facts, you have failed to transmit your truth, right? It's like I say, I can tell you that there are not 40 words for snow in Inuit, but it doesn't mean a whole lot to you. I need to tell you a story around that. You need to know a whole lot more about that. If you understand your audience, you can bring an effective truth with a story. But you have to understand your audience. That's the skill. And factual truth is ineffective if it's completely without a story. Like a table of facts doesn't mean anything to anybody, really. So what's the function of stories? Well, they allow for knowledge. They allow us to accept and learn a thing for knowledge and or truth without removing personal involvement. Over 70% of what is talked about in conversation, not between women, by the way, before we all jump in there in our little stereotypes, okay, this is kind of gender equivalent, involves interpersonal relationships. It's about learning, bonding, understanding ourselves and others in context. And I said to you earlier, when I said the little picture of the boy, here's maybe an insight, right? You have the little boy, and what you think is, the poor lad, shouldn't he be out playing on the street? And the important thing was, because that's how I would feel when I look at him. This is how we interpret people's stories. This is why a Shanachie would have been good, is because he would know how you feel when he brings the story to you, and he knows this because of a theory of mind. Theory of mind is one of the more modern concepts in psychology. I actually like it a lot because it rhymes with a great many insights that I've had over the years looking at language and how people speak to each other and the things that they say, how people resolve misunderstandings, how people deal with misunderstandings. I like it very much because it's now become one of those scientific theories you're allowed to talk about. It used to be that it was the notion of, I'll bring this to you in a way you can understand. That notion was, well, I'll manipulate you until you're on my side. Right? But of course, that's not what it is. The notion of theory of mind, it addresses our ability to make sense of the social world, right? The ability to attribute mental states to ourselves and to others. It's the understanding that I have a rich mental life and it is not available to you, and that therefore you have one too, which is not available to me. And I need to anticipate and intercept your beliefs, intents, desires, your pretending, knowledge, and deception, so that I can understand when we're on the same page. And so that I can bring us to the same page, and the Shanachie would have to do that. I note that its deficit is evident in autism, schizophrenia, ADHD, and alcohol-induced neurotoxicity. These people who don't have a very good idea of what's going on in your life, or in your mind, I should say, and they also are not entirely clear that what's going on in their mind is actually going on in their mind, rather than, the facts about the happening world. So, in neuroscience, and this I find even more interesting, we know that the core mentalizing network, the network in the brain, where information goes, where the areas in the brain that are highlighted during fMRI tests, that there's a very big network involved in when you give somebody a theory of mind task. When you ask children to say, what do you think the person is thinking now? or how do you think this boy looks, or does he look bored to you, or whatever. The network that goes off there is really very big. It involves an awful lot of the brain. We're actually very, very busy with looking at situations and trying to understand what happens, trying to construct a story around situations so that we can get at the facts, interestingly enough. It involves at least all of those terrific big names, which I'll show you pictures of. There we go. Wasn't that easy? It involves, I don't want to talk too much about what brains do and which parts of them do what, but it involves speech areas, it involves visual areas, it involves areas that are associated with, I want to say reading, but what I really mean is narrative text. It involves areas of perception, it involves monitoring. A lot of monitoring goes on, particularly at the front of the head. We tend to monitor stuff that happens. This self-monitoring and monitoring of others goes on all the time. But what we also notice is that when people are involved in narrative comprehension, either as listeners or as speakers, there's a shared network for the theory of mind areas and for the narrative comprehension areas. What this would seem to say is that in trying to understand what we do and what the world is and the things we see around us, so we know people talk about it. They talk about it in story terms. They don't talk about it in facts, right? I will talk about that I'm going to go home and I'm going to get the train, but I'm not going to give my address and I'm not going to say the number of the train or how much the ticket costs. Those kind of things aren't interesting. And I only need to give you just a little bit of advice or a little bit of information before you will know pretty much what my trip home is going to be like. And while you're processing all of this information, what's happened is you're thinking about what it would mean to you, you're thinking about what it would mean to me, you're theorizing what's going on in my mind when I say these things, you're building hypotheses out of the way I've started talking this evening. What am I likely to mean when I say a thing? And that we can measure people's ability to understand narratives and their ability to understand other people with this whole theory of mind research that's being done on the borders between cognitive neuroscience and psychology. We can see that if you don't have a good theory of mind, you can't understand a story. And the people who can't understand a story are people who have difficulty functioning socially. And actually, functioning socially is what we have to do in order to continue as a species. So stories become terribly important. The ability to tell them, to understand them, and to accept them as a form of arriving at the truth of any situation is actually probably much more important than understanding when, a certain number of subjects has given you a response a significant number of times and what the alpha level was and what the beta level was when you predicted your level of significance, for anyone who's interested in social science research. But so the idea of getting to the truth via stories is facts and situations get context with stories. We can produce a cognitive simulation in our mind of what's going on in your mind when you're telling a story, and the reflection that we have on that story then allows us to develop a personal understanding of the truth value of the story, to the point that we can end up saying, well, it may be true for you, but it's not true for me, and that will be a true statement and not just vague nonsense. That's actually what I wanted to say. That's it. Am I done?
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I'm going to take questions. Yep.
Hi, I had a question about the nature of these stories that I don't remember how, like the administrators of the law in ancient Ireland used. Did these stories belong to a corpus that was somehow codified or at least handed over, or did they make them up? Because
You make them up, and in fact it still happens today. Oh, sorry. You make them up. And it still happens today. There are shanachi. They're not charged with passing down the law, but they are charged with passing down folklore and the stories and understandings of what it means to be Irish. And the kind of thing that would happen is, you'll come in and you'll go, like that one Rosemary is really getting on my nerves. She really annoys me. She just really annoys me. And instead of a Shanachie responding with, well, you could do, you know, this thing to solve that problem, or you could do that thing, he'd say, oh, sure, I'll tell you, I knew a man. I knew a man once, and oh God, he was awful annoying. And then he'll come with a story. And what he's had to do is he's had to pick up from your complaint immediately what kind of annoyance it is, what kind of a story he could produce that would give you context and make you feel empathy with the person, how he can draw you into that story, and how he can present a solution to your problem by having you identify with the solution that somebody else found, which of course they didn't find because he made it up, right? Oh yeah.
So, I mean, it is understood that the story is presented as factual, as in I knew a man,
yeah.
But it is understood not to be factual.
Well,
but
you might have known a man. They generally contain a bit of truth, right? I mean, think about it. If you have to make up stories all day, you'd want to have something to base them on. And that's why I didn't leave out the correspondence theory of truth. There have to be some facts in there someplace. I mean, if you said I knew an alien, that's not going to help anybody.
Thank you.
Who's next?
Hi. It's very related to what we just spoke about. What kind of education would they get? How would you become one?
You just got to be good at telling stories. It's a funny thing. No, really. It's a cultural value. You know, I don't know, you live in the Netherlands, I think you were saying earlier, yeah. You'll know that one of the cultural values of living in the Netherlands is about being gezellig. There's no translation for that, and everybody can do it. They all know how, right? Okay. Telling stories is something all Irish people can do, and if you can't do it, you just die. You have no life. You have no friends. You've got to tell stories. You've got to be able to tell stories. Everyone can tell stories. Everybody can.
Can everyone become a child?
No, if they have nothing better to do, for sure. And if you're really good at telling stories and enough people want to listen to you, you become a Shanachie. Yeah, sure, sure. And I have had an Irish student who, she came, I work in the Netherlands too, and she came over to this college where I work, and part of what I do is I'm a tutor, which means I'm available to listen to students and to advise them about the curriculum, and I spend a lot of my time saying, I knew this student once. Mostly it's true, right? You know, I want to do art history. Well, I knew the student Amira once. I mean, it's true, I did. I really did know her. But, you know, the way I tell the story will depend on what I want that student to think. And my Irish student said to me, she says, you know, this job, it's just like being a Shanachie, isn't it? I said, yeah, it is, yeah, yeah. And it's not like you're kind of compulsively lying to people all the time. You're bringing a truth. You better, I mean, what you say had better be true for that person. It better be true. Otherwise, you failed. So there's a conflict here between, you know, do you just make it up? Well, no, it's not factual, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be.
Question in the back.
This is not really a fully formed question, but I was thinking a lot while you were talking about theory of mind about empathy. I guess I'm curious about, are there already theories in relation to this theory of mind of how it builds empathy between people?
How it builds empathy, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the need for theory of mind, the theory of mind explicates the need for empathy. If you can't bring empathy to your social situations, then actually you have a lot of trouble functioning well socially in any case. And we all have it, we generally all have it to some degree or other. And it seems to be that the more effective your theory of mind is, the more empathy you can have with somebody else. And also the more flexible your theory of mind is. The acceptance that, you know, I think one thing, but these other people will experience it or think it in many different ways allows you to be more empathetic. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a key part.
Thank you so much, and also compliments on your graphic design. I like that a lot.
I put a lot of time into it, I got to tell
Oh
you.
no, I'm not making a joke. I thought it was excellent. I just had a question related to this theory of mind. When you're studying people's levels of theory of mind, and let's say that you have a group of people, maybe they're not all in the same place, but they're in your study, and they're all theory of mind deficient.
Yeah.
Do new forms of language or kind of typical speech patterns or logics that we don't necessarily have
Well, what happens is they tend to be much more concrete and factual, generally, apart from the neurotoxicity issues, and that's where they're concrete and factual about things that nobody else can see. You know, that they can't relate to other people, and they tend to become, you know, kind of paranoid in the way they see things, and they see things as being facts, which everybody else says, actually, I can't see it that way at all. But people with autism, with ADHD, with schizophrenia, they tend to be much less about the stories. And it's interesting, if you look at the narrative of schizophrenics who are explaining, you know, the voices in their head, the sisters on the moon, the stuff that they've seen, they tend not to be great storytellers. They can tell it in fragments, and they tell it as a series of facts. But indeed, they're not personally involved, and I actually think that the previous speaker addressed that. So, yeah. I mean, and the famous stories about schizophrenics are the ones where, unusually, they can tell a story. So, yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary. Two things. I find it very funny that no one today but you has spoken about truth, which is when you're talking about speech and even about objects, it's something, I don't know, it's funny that I think, as we call it in the arty talk or the arty world.
Arty people. There's no truth in art.
Well, the thing is, truth is not something that I have come across, actually, all that much. I mean, also here at Witte, it's not something that's on our on our radar necessarily when we organize any events or exhibitions. So it's funny that there's this big hiatus. Am I sounding very weird? Yeah. So that's one thing. And then, second, of course, there's the opposite, which is the lie, which I think is an equally, you know, how do lies function then in that way? And I'm actually want to bridge it to one of the very first sessions this morning about conservation, because in that sense conservation could be considered as trying to find the truth about these objects that we have, and we're left with them, or they're left with us, and we maybe this is maybe also a question for Brian, if conservation is trying to get, you know, the truth of the object, or yeah, this could be a thing for the round table. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond, or do you want to save it? Well, about lies, I actually have a fairly radical idea about lies. I think that a lie is something which deliberately blocks understanding, but I don't think it's the opposite of truth. A lie would be for me to say to you something which would stop you understanding something you're trying to understand. If you ask me a question, if you say it's, you know, what time is it? If I say it's 3 o'clock in the morning, the only reason that's a lie is because probably the reason you're asking the question is to know, are we finished with this now? Can we move on, please? Right? So I'm blocking your understanding. But if you say to me, you know, do I love my dog? Yes, I do. But if I wake up in the morning and the dog is sicked up on the carpet and you ask me if I love my dog, I might say no. And neither of those things actually is a lie, right? And they're not a lie because I'm not trying to obstruct your understanding of anything. I don't mind when things contradict each other, and I definitely don't mind if you have to explain something without using facts, or if you just invent facts. I have no problem with that at all. That's perfectly fine, as long as I'm facilitating your understanding and our communication. So that's one thing I think about that. About truth in the art world, or, you know, well, that's not what you were saying, but about, you know, it's interesting that nobody was talking about truth. I actually don't think that truth in the way most people think about it, which is factual truth, I don't really think that that necessarily has a place in art from my very non-art perspective. I think art and elements of culture are exactly that expression of humanity that does distinguish us from other stuff. People say language distinguishes us from other species. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. That's nonsense. But I do think that being able to create art, things that are, you know, representations of our world, whether they're true or not, but just people's experiences and interpretations, I think that those are kind of, I don't think truth is relevant. Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to respond about truth. I feel like actually everyone today has really touched on it. Sorry, Sam. You know, in my presentation, I was actually did respond to that, the idea that conservation traditionally thought about, you know, objects as having a truth, and it was our goal to reveal that truth and uncover that truth. And archaeology, I think, dealt with that as well. And we've since moved past that a little bit, recognizing that it's really not, you know, you can't return an object necessarily to truth. It's really to a more truthful state. It's really just about revealing meaning. And I think the talks about translation today, they dealt with the same issue, you know, that you're not really, you have, you're working with something and you're trying to reveal a sense of intentionality or originality, but by working with it, you are inherently changing that and adding to that. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you guys want to add on to that?
Actually, I think that since the discussion is going so well so far, I'd like to invite everyone, and we can just move towards the roundtable discussion. So if I would ask from our very kind and generous speakers to go up and take a seat, we can continue this conversation.
I guess we'll just continue the conversation from your presentation, Rosemary. I actually was kind of interested in your comment, and from the other question of people who has brain deficiency tend to see things as more factual, and they're less capable of making stories. And for me, I think there's also this layer of the translation issues, and also the misunderstanding or unfamiliarity of a foreign language environment. You tend to only capture the things that are facts. Like, for example, you don't really get the humor from like a cultural metaphors that is very culturally specific, or you cannot understand the talk shows because you don't get all these story-making rhetorics.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So I was wondering, what's your comment on that? I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because sometimes I feel like I have this brain deficiency, in a sense.
Well, I for sure have those deficiencies. I actually have those specific deficiencies when talking to native English speakers from another culture, like Americans or British people or Australians. I'm in a very Irish tradition. I have family all over the world. And one of my brothers was married to a French girl, and another of my brothers is married to a Spanish girl, and we were having Christmas dinner, and we were sitting around the table thinking we were just, look at us, we're just so funny, that's so funny. And my very stylish and intelligent sisters-in-law said, well, it's like this, right? We figured out when we're supposed to laugh, because we know when the key moments are, but actually we just don't think you're very funny. I think humor is very difficult to translate. It's very, very difficult to translate. And I also think that the things that one culture will find funny in its set of humor, another culture may find that set of humor funny, but for different reasons. Dutch people they just love Monty Python. I am so done with Monty Python. I was done with Monty Python in the 1980s. Most British people were done with Monty Python in the 1990s. Why is it that Dutch people still think that's one of the funniest things ever? I mean, you know, there's nothing wrong with Dutch people, so it must be that they have they think something else is funny. And it doesn't translate. You just cannot tell someone why something is funny. You can't. I think that that's just lost. That just can't ever happen. And it's not really the language, it's the culture that's behind it. There's just some stuff you cannot get. And I think it will always be true that, you know, when a group of Irish people are in the bar saying really unpleasant things about themselves, and a foreigner comes in, and suddenly everybody's really polite and nice, and the foreigner goes, God, Irish people are so friendly, if only you knew. The reason, if we're friendly, what it means is you're a stranger, we don't know you, you're not one of us. That's what it means. And you can only know this by being there, by leaving the country, going into another situation and coming back. So I think you're right. There's a real problem of translation, you know?
Rosemary. I'm actually wondering if we can draw a little bit of a parallel between what was discussed earlier during Christina's session when we were talking about lingua franca, well, anyway.
It's a non-native, look.
Okay. And international art English. And then I know that you've conducted research on University College Utrecht about the accent and English accent that gets formed on these campuses that includes international students. So maybe you can share a little bit with us?
I can, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I can for sure. So that's true. There's this international campus. Students live there, and they come from all over the world. And what I think is there's one very key thing, and that is that the native speakers are at about 5% of the population, and the rest are non-native speakers. And what happens with the students when they come out at the end of 3 years? They don't all sound like each other. I mean, you know, if you came from Italy, you're going to come out with an Italian accent because you came from Italy and that's where you have, unless you spent a lot of time trying not to have an Italian accent, which I do not recommend. But what will happen is that there'll be all kinds of aspects of Dutch and Bulgarian and Spanish will infiltrate your English in a very systematic way. So, for example, we all know that from the Dutch context that Dutch people don't distinguish in the same way between a and as, say, British English would do. So bed can mean a bad thing, or it can mean a thing you lie down and go to sleep in, right? I had a bed day, or I'm going to bed. That's when, what you see is that that confusion with the a distinction actually enters into the English of these students. Also the native speakers, right? Also the native speakers. And what's important about it is that if you go to this college, you went there because you wanted to be there. So you automatically have a positive identity with the way people speak there. Doesn't matter how they speak, you want to speak like that too. It's not conscious, but after 3 years, you've picked up all these features of non-native English in your accent. When you leave the college, you sound very fluent, right? Everybody sounds very fluent. They've been having an academic education for 3 years, and they've been talking, playing, sleeping, eating, drinking, everything in English. They go abroad, and lots of them will go to the same universities, and they are recognizable as coming from that funny little place in the Netherlands. They're recognizable. People say to them. That's what's inspired this data collection that we're doing. So, and that's unusual linguistically, because it means that there has been an emergence of an accent for which there is no native, right? This is a non-native native variant, if you like. There are some UC babies, but not yet at the college. So the UC graduates, this accent has emerged. It's part of communication accommodation. It's accommodation to a positive identity, which I think when you relate that back to the problems that you have with translation and with the hegemony of the natives, it's actually quite important that we produce, out of this group you have this very, very articulate, educated, super competent group of people who go abroad, impress everybody, and are recognizable by their non-nativeness in English, but never negatively. Right? And I think that that's key, and that's really important. Yeah.
I like very much to pick up on that thread, because I think it's something we've been discussing around among participants, intervenants of the conference, outside the conference, is that what you're saying is something that is crossing out few of the presentations. That is a basic, it's always the same kind of thing I'm saying, I feel, that it's a really basic Foucauldian move to recognize language as a mode of inscription of identity in the social fields. And I'd like to bring up a bit of mythology in that, because it can get things more cogent and illustrated. Is the famous episode of the Odysseus of Homer, where Ulysses is facing the Cyclops, who is named Polyphemus, not Polysemus, but Polyphemus, and is asked by the Cyclops to give his name. And the answer Ulysses gives, he invents words, he makes a linguistic invention, and he says, my name is no man, in French it's personne. He says he's called no man, and he invents a Greek word in the Odysseus. The Greek word is oudeis, and oudeis became afterwards the name of the mouth cavity, and also the kind of line that crosses out the mask of ancient tragedy. As if, somehow, the physical and material space of elocution was the space where there is kind of withdrawal of identity. And I think it kind of mirrors what you were saying, and some kind of, you know, the grafted tongue, what you've been bringing up, what Chris was talking about. I mean, the voice you instrumentalized in a way. So I just wanted to bring this kind of mythology part to the conversation.
I'd like to ask a question. I was very interested how you were bringing in the neurological effects of the brain on the idea of the theory of mind, and you said that the narrative comprehension activated the same areas of the brain.
They share.
They share
many of the
areas.
same, yeah.
And I was wondering if there had been any testing along the lines of visual narratives that you were aware of.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
How does
So,
that affect?
well, one of the areas that's primarily excited when you read something or when you look at text specifically, that's what you mean with visual, or do you mean movies and?
I'm thinking visual narratives in terms
art
of
and
something that
pictures
is like a narrative that is constructed solely by images.
Okay.
So something
Yeah.
I'm thinking like international stick figure, or signs, like very basic things, or even comics without words, this type of thing. Because I think in my presentation I was trying to discuss a narrative that was more or less without language.
That's one of the
And
things,
only
that's actually in this whole examination of theory of mind, there are two approaches to it. One of them is to actually base the experiments that you do on stories. So you have stories and people are asked questions based on the stories, right? But then you have other ones where there is no story, where you have not stick figures, but geometrical shapes, right? So little triangles, and one of the triangles will go bouncing over to the other triangle and it'll lean over and tip it with its tip and go back. And what do you think happened here? That's the kind of stuff that happens. You're asking, how do you think the triangle feels? Oh, I think he's in love with the other triangle, and this is the kind of stuff that people say, right? And what they're clearly trying to do is to develop a theory of mind in a geometrical shape without any language or anything happening at all. Yeah, just looking at gestures and movement and yeah.
Would anyone from the public care to give a comment or a feedback as well? You can feel free to jump in at any time. Just show me a sign. Anyone else? Okay. Well, maybe, okay. So I'll bring up another point. I've been reading a text from 2006 by Tutor. She did a lecture performance called The Language of Things, which I think also links to a lot of the things we've been discussing throughout the day. And she starts that lecture with a quote by Walter Benjamin, who's also been referred to today. That quote is, "Who does the lamp communicate with? The mountain, the fox?" And she already starts her text by saying, according to him, the language of things is mute, it is magical, and its medium is material community. The language of things has to be translated in order to become intelligible for those of us who are dumb for its silent splendor. And in this text, she also mentions that Benjamin ignores the feature of translation. But then, as also was mentioned earlier, there is another text by Walter Benjamin that talks about the translation itself. Further in this text, Tutor says, the language of law, music, or art is are languages of practice, and translation doesn't take place between them, but within them. And then she also argues that the language of things and the language of men concerns the relationship of humans to the world as a whole. So I'm putting this out there as food for thought in terms of how to combine the different aspects of our world and how to combine also the different sessions that we've had during the day, starting with Lee, who talked about the dynamic objecthood, and further, we discussed also about how language actually evolves within a certain field, namely the art field. And I'm wondering if any of my peers today would care to comment further on these ideas and how language is also used as a form or a tool for us to put words onto inanimate object and to explain our world. No, okay, that did not inspire anyone.
That is such a no, but that would take minutes to.
Oh,
too much
Yes. So the
also
opposite.
another topic of the day.
But I have a comment on that, Amir. I was thinking it's interesting how we started indeed with objecthood and the language of objecthood. And then with your presentation, I think the first words were truth, what is it for? And you said maybe the truth is not coming so much today, and maybe it's one of these words that in art have to be avoided somehow, or at least in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even more, have to be avoided. But our own history is always around truth, or was all around truth. But then different types of truth, as I was trying to say in the Byzantine icons, for example, is this immediate truth, and it's not necessarily a scientific, factual truth, but it's all around that and all the misunderstandings about it. So, I don't know, do we still dare to talk about truth? When you mentioned Walter Benjamin, indeed, in The Task of a Translator, is about this abyss of language and impossibility of translation. I wanted to bring up another phrase. It's from another text of his, and he's talking about the moment when the idea of language is just being born in yourself, like the moment when you're just about to write in the beginning, like when you write your diary, and it's like first consciousness both of speech and language, but also of who you are, of internal knowledge. And then he writes this very mysterious phrase. It says, "I am, it knows a ray of light." So, I am, it knows a ray of light. Now, this is definitely not a factual truth, but I also wonder whether it could be in what you categorized as personal truth. Could that be maybe a truth of what objects or what art objects talk about?
I think that's... Hello? I think that's what I mean when I said that I'm not sure truth is relevant for art when you interpret it in that very scientific way, which you were talking about. When you say, truth is about facts and they've got to be real and you've got to be able to map them onto a real thing outside your mental world, those truths exist, those facts exist, and we need them to build our, what I like to think of as our personal truths, the ones we've arrived at. But I think of course you can talk about truth with art, but I think those are the kind of truths you're talking about there. It is personal. I mean, if you create art that's coming from somebody's vision about something, somebody's interpretation of the world, somebody's ideas, opinions, beliefs, wants, desires, dislikes, I don't know, and all of those things are coming out of some form of personal truth. But it is a problem with the word truth. It's a problem because it means so many different things, and maybe that's the reason that you avoid using it, is because it has too many contexts. And certainly in the Western world, there is a moral value on factual truth, which is positive, and there is a moral value on story truth, which is negative. And that's a problem. That's why I love theory of mind.
Yeah, I was really interested in that part where you were talking about how we're not actually interested in the thing, but we're interested in the thing or the story around the thing. And then what you were saying, it just kind of reminded me of this kind of pervasive argument in contemporary art when it comes to how do we mediate it. Does the thing tell its own truth to the viewer directly with no mediation necessary, or is the art so convoluted that it requires some exhaustive story around it? Those seem to be the two sort of polar arguments that come from the sort of populist camp. And the populist camp is growing and growing and growing. So it seems like the more that we're talking about language and the more different perspectives that we're getting from language seems to be a kind of synthesis of maybe all of these different categories, is that there's actually, the thing that comes from synthesizing these categories might be some sort of tool set, I think, actually, when it comes to language and mediation. That's the best I can do to put your two comments together.
Yeah, but to continue to pick up on that is that where Benjamin is interesting to understand when he posits translation as the space that both links and separates, let's say, to epistemologies or to cultures or to symbolic worlds. He doesn't posit translation as a motif or an instrument of borders transgression or bridge construction. He always posits it as a kind of vertical descent in the texture of the multiplicity of separations that constitute the way words carry meaning. That's the way he describes it in the task of the translator, which is more a way to embrace truth not through communication. That would be what mediations in museums and cultural institutions do, but by access to truth via an intensification of the negative space that exists between several modes of access to truth. That's more what Benjamin is saying in the task of the translator, that sometimes, I don't know the original German title, but there are in few languages, no, but the task of the translator is mistranslated as the task of the creator, which says enough, you know.
Question?
I have the feeling that over the course of the afternoon we've been balancing between a passive and an active relationship to language. Passive being the way, for instance, our non-native quality as a speaker will affect us or prevent us from saying what we want to say, or the way an accent is going to assign an identity to us, and a more active way in perhaps in the activity of translation, for instance, when we sort of attempt to gain power over language and gain more agency through it, again, to use that word again. And I was wondering if disease, but I don't really want to call them this way, or for instance, logoria or aphasia, or even perhaps going as far as inextinguishable laughing, or syndrome de Tourette, or all these language impeachments could be seen as a form of subversion of this dialectics between passive and active relation to language. I don't know if I make myself super clear, but it's going back again to this Disco Latin text by Hito Sterl, where she basically says that maybe these mistakes and this supposed impoverishment of language that non-native speakers like me perform every day is actually turns into a form of subversion that becomes productive. And I wonder if this we could use also logoria or parrhesia or these other diseases as tools to subvert these relationships that we have to language.
No, I mean, I don't know. Personally, I would think, at least this is what I have come to realize also in my own experience as like a non-native speaker and a translator, that in order for something in this sense to be subversive, or at least to, it's a word that I tend to employ with a certain care, so I would say even like to change the canon, or like to requires an act of awareness. That is, otherwise, would you say, for instance, that making a mistake is subversive? No, making a mistake is making a mistake. It becomes subversive when you deliberately make a mistake and refuse to correct it, because you say, okay, this is how I speak. This is, for instance, a friend of mine noticed that I used to imitate, I've had a relationship with an American woman for a long time, and I used to imitate the American accent a lot. And this friend of mine used to tell me that it sounded kind of, you know, it wasn't nice to hear. She was Italian as well, and she would say it wasn't nice to hear. It didn't sound good. And it took me a while to realize what she was saying. I mean and it's not that I've switched back to the Italian accent, like deliberately underlining it, but I think that it became something that can be subversive in this sense, only in so much as it is conscious, it is deliberate, and you refuse to consider it a mistake. So of course I'm not an expert in like language dysfunctions, but I would say that, for instance, the Tourette syndrome, I wouldn't see it as that because it's something uncontrollable. So I would say, at least from my experience, that I would see something as subversive the moment in which it's done purposefully with that aim. Otherwise, it's just, I think it's very hard to understand it. Maybe you can see it as that. Again, in terms of personal truth. I don't know if what I said was clear or made any sense.
I think I'd agree with that. I think in order for something to be subversive, there has to be intention. I'm pretty sure about that. And most of the people certainly people who have aphasia, are acutely aware of it, and it's very distressing to them, and their intention is to be anything but aphasic. But I can maybe tell my anecdote now about the sort of the opposition to the native hegemony. I used to work for the European Space Agency. I did a project with them, and we had to write quite a bit of text and hand in reports. And I don't know, I mean, for native speakers who are here, when planets go around things, in my world, they are in orbit, right? That's what I've learned. That's been all my books, and and I would keep getting these texts back saying that the Mir, the space station at the time, was on orbit, and that's just plain wrong. Stupid non-natives, wrong. And I kept sending it back, corrected, and they kept sending it back to me. And at some point, I called the project leader and I said, listen, I just got to tell you, it's a bit embarrassing for the European Space Agency. Seriously, you've got to get this right. And he said, sorry, for whom is this embarrassing? There are far more non-natives working here than natives. You are in the minority. The term is officially on orbit. And it is. And it is. So actually, the non-natives just have to grasp their non-nativeness, and they have to just embrace it. And if this is the way you say a thing, this is the way you say a thing. And if I can't figure out what it means, then I have a problem with theory of mind. That's my problem, and I have got to fix that. And I think that's how you want to get subversive, I think, I would say.
I guess I understand the other element of your question is you're actually thinking about this contagious sort of potential of the non-native speaker to sort of create this, I don't know, like modes of communication, and it will have a political effect. But I don't know if language can play the role as good as images in a way. I don't know. I guess this is just what's in my mind, because Hiro Stero also, we keep going back to her. I think she also has a text to defend the pool image. In a way, I don't know, because thinking about social network and thinking about this potential public space for speech in a sense of communicating, I don't know if images can be more sort of universally accessible than, say, I don't know, a mediated version of English, for example. I mean, I just leave it to open questions.
It was funny because actually when I was mentioning this the Chinese netizens, for example, I was immediately thinking of the, mud grass horse kind of phenomenon. And I think that's something basically it sounds similar but different tones of basically fuck motherfucker. So it's like a yes, exactly. So they kind of created a myth around it, and it became kind of picked up some political subversion towards the state. And at some point, IYY was naked, jumping with a fictive kind of animal that was kind of adopted. That is a 草泥马, basically, and he jumped naked and covered himself as a protest towards the government. And at some point, the internet tried to all these what do you call those people? Censors try to dissuade people from using this image, or like what you call an internet meme, basically, that was circulating in kind of the Chinese internet world. But I wonder if that's something very specific for Chinese netizens.
as the same as LOL cats. I mean, it's maybe for someone from Asia, you don't really get what's funny about this thing. So I think in the internet, there's a different kind of circulation of language that's kind of bound to cultures and imagery itself.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I wanted to make explicit in my own presentation, the ability of what I've been calling the clinical gestures of Western epistemologies to affix a fixed meaning on certain things, to posit a certain continuity between language and an object, opens this object to a whole set of captures by institutions of control or by capital, in a way. So there is a way how Western epistemologies convey language to open certain parts of the world to technologies of extraction and capture and value production. So there is a continuity with institution of power. And that's where maybe there is always a kind of fascination for motifs of escape to these captures that are sicknesses, mental disabilities. They are not intentional, but they are somehow the counter figures of that which cannot be attained by certain technologies of captures. Yeah.
Are there really? Like I was, for example, when I was analyzing the Wolfson writing, and of course his writings were much picked up by Deleuze, it made total sense. But as I was reading the text he wrote, I was wondering how much he was actually saying about language. There was this very weird system of translation, jumping from word to word, and I can understand that it kind of could illustrate some of Deleuze's ideas well, but it seemed to me that it was pushed too much over it. So sometimes I wonder whether we overuse images of, dysfunctional language to illustrate that which could resist power. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Okay, so I misunderstood you. I misunderstood them too.
That's fine.
I just wanted to link a little bit what's been saying and talk about set of references, especially when we are talking about translation. So I'm going to mention another example, and it's this book I had to work on for Witte de Witte. It's called On Super Diversity. That was written by Tariq Ramadan that I had to translate into Arabic. And then I mentioned this example just because, it was, first of all, written by a non-native English speaker, even though his English was perfect. But in terms of working on this Arabic translation, I had to put myself in this binary mode of thinking between one context and another, because, as we all know, literal translations don't go very far, and it's more about creating this set of references, also being able to find the accurate references, being able to refer to a set of ideas that can be more understandable in the Middle East rather than in the Western world. So I think the context here, also in terms of talking about space and in terms of talking about the different cultures, is important in terms of how we translate our own ideas and how do we mediate between both worlds, basically. Do you want to?
Yeah, of course, this example is particularly relevant, I would say, just for the title. If I have not read the book, but I would say that as a translator, I would be in dismay if I were to translate this into Italian, because, of course, there is a word, just thinking of the title, there is a word for diversity in Italian, it's diversità. It's like, but it does not mean diversity, it means difference. Diversity and difference are absolutely not synonymous. The diversity, like in the English language, has a political baggage that has just no equivalent in the Italian society. You could not translate it in, of course you can say super diversità, but you would already completely miss everything. So it's already something that would require a footnote in the title. But this is, I think, particularly, this is exactly what is the point. But then here as a translator, I would say you're just lost. What do you do? Of course, you call the editor, you say, can I put a footnote? But it's basically about this. It's.
And then you end up with never-ending metaphors about what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
And what can we say about editing? Can we consider editing as a form of exclusion of language? What's your idea on that?
It's just, I was also discussing this before with a friend in the public, and the strange thing is that editing, which is something that in the art world and in the English language publishing world is something that we are extremely used to and we accept, is also in a way a culturally determined practice. For instance, in my experience with Italian newspapers and magazines, even like ones with quality reputation, editing is something that does not happen so lightly. And when I send my pieces to Corriere della Sera to be edited, usually this means that like they proofread them and maybe they say, okay, I would just cut this last sentence because we don't have enough space. And when usually, and this has happened to me, but has happened to many, many writers, the first time you publish on an English language magazine is a disaster because you send your piece for editing, which in your mind means proofreading, and you get something that is like a battlefield of, comments and marks. And it just, in a way, another way of understanding authorship. I mean, the role of the editor is just something that does not have so much of an equivalent. So, of course, this too has to be taken into account when you consider this kind of practice. I mean, of course, at the beginning, and still, it's very hard for me, whenever I get a text back from an English magazine, not to feel like personally hurt and disempowered in my authorship because of this. And it's just like a different set of cultural parameters. So I don't know if this is answering your question or it's just the...
I can speak to that as the evil native English speaker. I can just say that I can't stand it when you send it to an editor and nothing comes back. It's just a couple,
but of course,
couple tiny copy edits. The really good ones, and we're all getting them also, are the ones that come back red, and that person is saying like, putting track changes with comments and all kinds of stuff, and even suggestions for entirely new structures. That's fantastic. I mean, I like it when they get brutal. I want them to just get medieval on a text.
I have to make a disclosure. I just translated a text by Chris, and and I heavily edited it into Italian. Of course, it needed some adjustments, and it's just a way of doing the editing without telling the author.
But see, that already shows. And I've actually wrote something like mi dispiace, ma il mio italiano non molto bene, or something in the thing, and then said that I'm going to do it all in English because. You have to sort of look at all of these Italian words, and then you just realize there's nothing I can do, so I just have to trust this person. But you understand, it's not just translating, it's actually rewriting in a lot of cases, because I also don't speak Dutch, and certainly not with a Flemish accent, but we have to translate all of our texts in Antwerp, and I can't read them or verify them, so I just hope that they're correct. So it's really interesting, and this also being on this panel today has really been quite interesting to think about the fact that I never work anywhere where English is a first language, and everything that I write is being translated into another language, and I can't read it. So there's all this text everywhere that's like I have no idea what it's about.
We're fighting as to who's going to speak.
I have a more sort of meta question, I guess, because I feel that truth, okay, I would never use the word truth, because in any context that I circulate in, I would be attacked immediately. And I realized that as we were talking through this, I realized that the idea of a singular truth, I think I abandoned that about 10 years ago, just pretty much wholesale abandoned it. And I say this as a translator who's translated for many years and who retranslates and rewrites my own stuff in another language, and I'll just rewrite it if I think it doesn't make sense. In Chinese, I'll just take it and change the structure of it or take stuff out if I think it's not right. And I wonder, since we're talking about objects, or since these are circulating in my mind, I wonder how much truth is relative to authenticity. So that's something that I'm also thinking of. And when we say truth, also, just to get this out of my head, I think of a possibility of multiple sort of coexisting contradictory truths, which I really like the idea of the contradiction of these truths happening at the same time, and us sort of being okay with that.
There's a terrific book you can read called The Things They Carried. And he actually has a whole chapter where he tells the same story with totally different facts that contradict each other. And he says there's a difference between story truth and happening truth. That you would really like. There's something else that I want to think about in this business of translation and the truth of an object and describing things. I notice, because I live in the Netherlands, obviously it's Dutch that's occurring to me now, but I've had this when I lived in Germany and when I lived in Italy. I noticed that there are terms in Dutch which describe things that other people don't want to talk about. There's a word gedogen. There's a word versterven. Do you remember that from that class about euthanasia and stuff? I'll tell you now in a second. And there's a word verzuilen. Versterven is a practice that actually all hospitals in the world take part in, and certainly nursing homes take part in, which is when old people, they're kind of done. They just don't want to eat anymore. They're just done. And they're happy, they're not in pain, you know, well, happy is a big word. They're not in pain and they're in the nursing home and they're lying there and they stop wanting to eat. In principle, you have to feed them. So you're supposed to feed them intravenously. But very often, the decision is made non-explicitly to just let it pass. If they're not hungry, they don't have to eat their dinner. And they die. And there's a word for that in Dutch. And there's not a word for that in English. And there's not a word for that in French. And there's not a word for that in Italian. And then there's the word verzuilen. Verzuilen is a word which is actually, and this I find really interesting, it's translated, it's a term in human geography in any case. It's translated in English and is in the English literature on human geography as pillarization. Right? Now, if you say pillarization to a native speaker of English, and in fact possibly to many non-Dutch, non-native English speakers, which what? Yeah, yes, indeed. It sounds like, you know, some bad thing has happened to you, you've turned into a rock of salt or something, you know. Actually, what it means is, I'm not even sure if I can explain adequately what it means, but it's like, you know, I came from Ireland, I married a Dutch guy. It so happens, I didn't even know when I met him, it so happens he's a Catholic, right? And he moved with me to Amersfoort, which is not where he was born, and he doesn't know anybody there, right? And we've lived there for 14 years, and it became evident to me last year that every single person I know in Amersfoort is Catholic. I would never ask anyone what their religion is. I'm an atheist anyway. But somehow that has happened. And what that is this kind of cultural bonding, a common discourse that you're not aware you have about everything, about the way you dress, the way you treat your kids, the words you use, the type of car you drive, the roads you live, the streets you live in, all of these things. And none of us aware of it. None of us aware of it. But on some level, people are aware of it. And that's called pillarization. It's actually to do with historical, you know, where you were in the Reformation or whatever. But no? Okay, well then we'll have a better explanation of it over there from someone who really knows what it is. But what's interesting is that there is absolutely no way you can find a word in English that will represent that meaning. And pillarization definitely doesn't do it. Because it's not about pillars, even though the Dutch word for zuilen does have something with zuilen and pillars and stuff. Maybe you even want to explain what it is. But so you have these terms which get translated from a language, from a culture where they arose, and they get, you know, absorbed into English and used in some academic way that everybody has to learn them, but the concepts themselves become much more obscure than they need to be. It's already a very obscure concept for me. I just can't quite get it. And I can't understand how this happened to me either. And I think that that's a really interesting thing in translation, is that sometimes we just find a word because we've got to use it, because this is English. We can't be saying Dutch. We have to write it in English. And there just isn't one. We can't make one up. Fix that problem for me, guys.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the idea of editing, because it's something very particular that is not about translation necessarily, but I remember correct me if I'm wrong, Vincent, but I think you said at some point that the museum is a place of purification. And I wonder if then, there's some curators sitting here in front of me, so I wonder if it would be pushing things too far, if you could say that making an exhibition is editing objects. You know, I'm just trying to find the bridge between the language and the object, which is our main topics of the day. So I wonder if that makes any sense to anyone.
I would say that it's more about translation, curating, going back a little bit to what Chris was saying in terms of mediation. I truly see the position of a curator as a mediator between the artist, the objects, and its public within a certain space and within a certain time. I don't know how the others feel about that, but...
I mean, I won't fall into the trap that would consist to define what is a curator.
No,
obviously, please, we don't have to talk about it. I mean, applying the register of text to objects is obviously the matter at hand. Dissoluting objects in the register of text, and then considering that the only mediation with the objective world is language, would be, I think, a mistake to dissolute objects, and among object, the exhibition making into language would be a mistake. I would rather, the same way I like to define translation in Benjaminian term, that is to say in the negative, to describe exhibition making as the construction of mode of resistance to the dissolution of all things in language, and to find ways to construct situations that work outside language. So no, reducing exhibition to translating and editing, I would say no. I don't know.
I think it also depends on other things, like is it a group show, is it a solo show, is it in a not-for-profit institution, is it in some other kind of place? All these different things factor into how you end up working with someone as a curator. I mean, I find that at Objectif exhibitions I work entirely different than when I'm doing group shows with artists. If you have 25 artists in a show, they need you to be like really on your shit about how this exhibition is going to be. And because with 25 voices it can get quite soupy real quick. But with working one-on-one with an artist over the course of 6 months, 1 year, it's more about just trying to facilitate for them. I mean, that's just for me. But I also think that while we can put wall text on the wall, we can make newspapers or catalogs. Ultimately, those things are coming with certain strictures coming from the institution. And the best way that you can speak about the show oftentimes is just by the way that those works are actually oriented in the space. If it's not material works, then how can you find other ways that the context and the little bit of matter, however immaterial that matter is, can be conveyed? So I don't know, I have to give one of these really boring answers, which is that it's always a case-by-case basis, I think, at least for myself.
Yeah, I also have a little comment. I think I'm totally in agreement with Vincent of what he says about the process of exhibition making is not, in my understanding, to trying to create an argument. Or, in other words, to trying to convince, to persuade your audience to trying to educate them of what this is about. I think it's more important of this creation of the situation that you're situated. And also, I think physicality is really important to be able to navigate through the exhibition, because I think they talk about it, like about the materials that the artists are used, and I think space is also part of the material that should be considered. I don't know, so it's not just about objects neither.
One thing, that the idea of what I was trying really was this idea of the museum as a place of purification, and that, you know, what is being purified, or what's the aim of this purifying, and what does that mean that it has to be purified? Or maybe my question should have been, could you elaborate on the idea of the museum as a place of purification more than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I feel I did a really long time, so I don't want to give my talk a second time, but It's a complex idea, but it's the idea is to reinscribe, I mean, to think exhibition as a motif, as a historical formation. So to isolate example, which I did, and to reinscribe them in a broader field of history of observation, to realize that the space of that I call of purification, that is to say of intensification of meaning, that is the exhibition, a space that is severed from our mundane world, where every detail counts, has to be reinscribed in the history of what can be called, when we use the word purification, I should say it's a word by Bruno Latour, who understands modernity as the big dissociation between what the moderns did in practice, that is to say the hybridization of techniques, technology and nature, so well that today climate is inside politics, and purification, the theory the moderns produced of themselves, the purification of the domain of the object and the domain of the subject by way of objectivation in science, the intensification of the subject as the space of production of meaning in aesthetics. So what I'm saying is that it's important to relocate exhibition in a space modernity handed down to us, and this space has to do with highly clinical gestures of isolation of factual truth in the world. And the fact is that Western epistemology, the process of Western epistemology is to expand the space of purification to the whole planet. And we did. Which doesn't allow us to see the plurality of possible worlds. And so, well, that I ended my talk like that. The question of separation, of identification of the lines of separation in the world by which we understand epistemic portions and engage with the kind of truth, happens in more and more clinical spaces. The populist space is one of these highly clinical space of identification of what shouldn't be in Europe, for example, what shouldn't be allowed in some country, for example. So I'm saying all that to understand today the space of purification that is in practice the space of exhibition has been taken in these political problems, and to think ways from this space of purification to invent modes of navigation and methodologies to that would allow us to not claim further the mistake of the moderns, and new methodologies that would allow us to see the plurality of the possible worlds. It makes things more complex, but you asked me.
Can I just respond very quickly to going before? Maybe the question when you said like editor and curating, maybe it's very difficult. I don't know how many here identify as curators, so I think it was a very kind of tricky persona in that sense. I don't know, I must say, when I was studying art history in the beginning, the role of the curator did not appeal at all to me. And actually I did associate it in my mind also with some kind of editing role, so kind of fertile, infertile work, basically. That kind of changed, that's what you said, case by starting making the first exhibition. That kind of relation totally changes. But maybe there is something which is even connected with the kind of like the museum space being as a purification space as well. And of course, most of people making exhibitions do work within the spaces, so that would go without saying. I think it's harder to actually admit it, or, well, a lot of times actually we even work with that knowledge in the background as trying to find new solutions. But there, of course, can have some visual similarities in the rearrangement of space. And thank God every situation is different.